The smoke from my fire pit curled lazily into the cool October evening air as I settled into my patio chair with a beer, completely unaware that my neighbor was already dialing 911 to report me for what she would later claim was an uncontrolled wildfire threatening the entire neighborhood. My name is Quentin Palmer, and I'm a real estate attorney who specializes in property law and HOA disputes in Austin, Texas. That Friday night would turn into the most satisfying legal case of my career, and it all started with a fire pit I'd carefully researched and legally installed just 3 days earlier. I'd moved into the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision 6 months ago, buying a beautiful 2-story home with a decent backyard that backed up to a small green belt. The neighborhood was nice enough, though I'd heard whispers about the HOA being somewhat aggressive. I made sure to read every single page of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions before I bought the house. As a lawyer who'd seen countless HOA nightmares, I wasn't about to walk into one blindly. The CCRs mentioned nothing about fire pits, and Texas state law was pretty clear about property owners' rights to have them as long as they met certain safety requirements. My fire pit was a commercial-grade model, situated 15 feet from my house, 12 feet from my fence line, and surrounded by a proper stone patio with a cleared radius of 20 feet. I'd checked Austin's fire codes, gotten the necessary permit from the city, and even had my backyard inspected to make sure everything was up to code. The inspector had given me a thumbs up and told me it was one of the better installations he'd seen in a residential setting. I had all the paperwork filed away in my home office because that's just how I operate. The flames were dancing peacefully, maybe a foot high, when I heard the sirens. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Sirens weren't uncommon in Austin, but then they got closer and closer. And then they were on my street. I stood up, confused, as a fire truck and 2 police cars pulled into my driveway, lights flashing like I was running some kind of meth lab. "Sir, we got a call about an out-of-control fire," the first firefighter said as he approached my backyard gate. He was already pulling out his radio, probably to report what he was seeing. I gestured to my modest fire pit. "You mean this?" The firefighter looked at my setup, then at his colleague, then back at me. "This is what was reported." "I have no idea what was reported, but this is the only fire on my property," I said, keeping my tone friendly. "These guys were just doing their jobs." The second firefighter walked around the pit, examining the stone surround, the clearance, the overall setup. "Do you have a permit for this?" "I do. Would you like to see it? That would be helpful." I went inside and grabbed my folder, which contained not just the permit but also the inspection certificate, photos of the installation process, the product specifications showing the fire pit met all safety standards, and a highlighted copy of the relevant sections of both city code and my HOA's CCRs. When I returned, one of the police officers had joined the firefighters. "Here you go," I said, handing over the documentation. "City permit issued 3 weeks ago, inspection passed 5 days ago, installation completed 3 days ago. This is my first time actually using it." The first firefighter flipped through the papers and let out a low whistle. "This is more documentation than most commercial properties have. Everything looks completely legal here." "So who called this in?" I asked. The police officer checked his notes. "A Patricia Kensington called 911, claiming there was an uncontrolled fire threatening neighboring properties. She identified herself as the HOA president. Of course. Patricia Kensington." I'd received exactly 3 pieces of mail from the HOA in my 6 months there, and all 3 had been signed by her with increasingly aggressive language about various violations that weren't actually violations. The first had been about my grass being a quarter-inch too tall, except I'd measured it and it wasn't. The second had been about my trash cans being visible from the street, except they were in the exact location specified in the CCRs. The third had been a warning about unauthorized modifications, because I'd planted flowers in my own front flower bed, which again was completely allowed per the CCRs. Is there any issue with my fire pit from a safety or legal standpoint? I asked the firefighter directly. None whatsoever. You've got better clearance than required. The pit itself is a good quality model, and everything is properly maintained. We'll note in our report that this was a false alarm and that the property owner was fully compliant with all codes and regulations. The police officer nodded. We'll note the same. Sorry for the trouble, sir. No trouble at all. You guys were just doing your jobs. Can I ask, though, is there any consequence for someone making a false emergency report like this? The officer's expression shifted slightly. Making a false report to 911 is actually a crime in Texas. It's usually a Class B misdemeanor, but in cases involving false fire reports, it can be more serious. We'll be documenting this in our report. After they left, I sat back down by my fire pit, but the relaxing evening vibe was thoroughly ruined. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos of everything. The fire pit from multiple angles, the clearances, the stone surround, the green grass around it showing there was no fire danger. I also took a screenshot of the time and date. Then I went back inside and made copies of all my documentation. 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Patricia Kensington standing there with her arms crossed. She was exactly what you'd picture when someone says, HOA president on a power trip. Mid-50s, blonde hair sprayed into submission, wearing what looked like country club casual clothing, and an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. Mr. Palmer, she said, not bothering with pleasantries. I'm sure you know why I'm here. I genuinely don't, but please enlighten me. Your illegal fire pit needs to be removed immediately, or the HOA will be forced to take legal action. I leaned against my door frame. What makes you think it's illegal? Open flames are not permitted in Meadowbrook Heights. It's a safety hazard and a violation of our community standards. Really? Can you show me where that's written in the CCRs? She blinked. Excuse me. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Can you show me the specific section that prohibits fire pits? I don't need to carry the CCRs around with me. I'm the president. I know what's in them. With all due respect, Patricia, I've read the CCR's cover to cover multiple times. There's no mention of fire pits, fire features, or outdoor fireplaces. There's a section about not creating nuisances and maintaining safety, but my fire pit meets all city and state safety requirements. I have the permits and inspections to prove it. Her face was starting to turn red. The HOA board has the authority to determine what constitutes a violation of community standards. Actually, no, you don't. Not arbitrarily anyway. Texas property law is very clear about this. HOAs can only enforce rules that are actually written in the governing documents or that have been properly voted on and added through the amendment process. You can't just make up rules because you don't like something. Are you trying to tell me how to do my job? I'm telling you what the law is. I'm a real estate attorney. This is literally what I do for a living. That stopped her for a moment, but only a moment. The board will be meeting on Monday to address this violation. You'll be receiving a formal notice. Looking forward to it, I said pleasantly. Have a good evening, Patricia. She turned on her heel and marched back to her Mercedes, which she'd parked in front of my driveway, blocking me in. I watched her drive away and then immediately went to my computer to start a documentation file. I typed up everything that had just happened, including direct quotes as best as I could remember them. I saved the file with a timestamp and backed it up to 3 different locations. Over the weekend, I did some research into Patricia Kensington and the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. What I found was illuminating. There were multiple complaints filed with the Texas Attorney General's office about the HOA's practices. Several former residents had left reviews on various websites describing aggressive enforcement of non-existent rules, arbitrary fines, and what appeared to be selective enforcement based on whether Patricia personally liked someone or not. I also found 3 pending lawsuits against the HOA, all related to violations of Texas HOA law. One was about improper meeting procedures, one was about discriminatory enforcement, and one was about unauthorized liens placed on properties. The HOA appeared to be hemorrhaging money on legal fees, which explained why the quarterly dues had been raised twice in the past 2 years according to the meeting minutes I'd received. Monday morning, I found a letter taped to my front door. It wasn't mailed, wasn't in my mailbox, just taped to the door with clear packing tape that left residue on my paint. The letter informed me that I was in violation of Section 7.3 of the CCRs, which dealt with nuisances and hazardous conditions. It demanded that I remove the fire pit within 72 hours or face a fine of $200 per day until compliance. The letter was signed by Patricia Kensington in her capacity as HOA president. I photographed the letter still taped to my door, showing the damage to the paint, then carefully removed it and photographed the residue left behind. Then I sat down and actually pulled up Section 7.3 of the CCRs. It was a general section about not creating conditions that were hazardous or constituted a nuisance to neighbors. It mentioned things like not leaving standing water that could breed mosquitoes, not creating excessive noise, not storing hazardous materials improperly. There was absolutely nothing that could reasonably be interpreted to ban a properly permitted and installed fire pit. I drafted a response letter that afternoon. In it, I acknowledged receipt of their notice, cited the specific text of Section 7.3, explained why my fire pit did not violate it, referenced the city permit and inspection, and noted that any fines levied would be contested, and that the HOA would be liable for my legal fees under Texas Property Code Section 209.006 if I prevailed. I sent it via certified mail and also emailed it to the HOA's listed contact address. Wednesday evening, I decided to use my fire pit again. I'd paid good money for it. It was completely legal, and I wasn't going to let Patricia's overreach keep me from enjoying my own property. I got home from work around 7, changed into jeans and a comfortable shirt, and started a small fire. I was sitting there, enjoying the warmth and the ambience when Patricia appeared at my back fence. "I see you've chosen to ignore the HOA's directive," she called over the fence. "I've chosen to follow the law," I called back. "The HOA's directive has no legal basis." "We'll see about that. I've already contacted our attorney." "Good. They might want to inform you about Texas property law before you dig this hole any deeper." She pulled out her phone and started recording. "Let the record show that Mr. Palmer is openly defying the HOA and creating a fire hazard in his backyard on Wednesday, October 15th, at approximately 7:30 p.m. I held up my own phone, which I'd started recording with as soon as she appeared. "Let the record show that Mrs. Kensington is harassing a homeowner for exercising his legal rights to use his property in a manner that is fully compliant with all applicable city, state, and HOA regulations. This is not harassment. This is enforcement of community standards." Do you have any evidence that my fire pit violates any written rule or poses any actual safety hazard? It's an open flame in a residential area. So, are the gas grills that I can see on at least 4 other patios from where I'm standing, including yours? Are those also violations? She faltered. That's different. Those are for cooking. Really? Show me in the CCRs where it says that makes a difference. Show me where it says anything about fire pits at all. I don't have to justify the HOA's decisions to you. Actually, under Texas law, you kind of do. HOAs have to follow their own rules and provide due process. You can't just make arbitrary decisions. She pointed her phone at me more aggressively, moving closer to the fence. You think you're so smart because you're a lawyer. But I've dealt with difficult homeowners before, and the HOA always wins. Always. The 3 pending lawsuits against your HOA suggest otherwise. Her face went pale, then red. Those are frivolous complaints by people who couldn't follow simple rules. Those are homeowners standing up for their rights, just like I'm doing. Enjoy your fire while you can. The fines start tomorrow, and they'll keep adding up until you comply. We can and will place a lien on your property. Any lien you place without proper authority will be illegal. And since I'm documenting everything, including this conversation, you might want to be very careful about your next steps. She stormed off, and I could hear her muttering angrily as she went back into her house, which was 3 doors down from mine. I saved the video to multiple locations and sent a copy to my work email for good measure. The next morning, there was another letter on my door, again taped with the same clear packing tape. This one informed me that as of Thursday, October 16th, I was being fined $200 per day for the continuing violation. It also stated that the fine would continue until I provided photographic evidence that the fire pit had been removed. I documented this letter the same way I had the previous one, including the damage to my paint. I called a meeting with my colleague, Marcus Chen, who specialized in civil litigation. We'd worked together on several HOA cases over the years. I showed him all my documentation. This is pretty egregious, Marcus said, scrolling through the photos and letters. They don't have a leg to stand on. I know. But I want to make sure I handle this correctly. If I'm going to fight this, I want to do it in a way that might actually create some positive change. You mean you want to make an example of them? I mean I want to make sure they can't do this to other homeowners who don't happen to be lawyers. Marcus grinned. I like it. So what's your strategy? First, I let them keep digging. Patricia is clearly not consulting with their attorney, or if she is, they're not giving her good advice. Every letter she sends, every fine she levies, every time she harasses me, it's more documentation of the HOA's overreach. You're building a case. Exactly. Then, once I've got enough documentation to demonstrate a pattern of harassment and abuse of authority, I'll file for declaratory judgment that the fines are invalid and request attorney's fees. If they've placed a lien by then, which I suspect they will, I'll also sue for damages related to that. And the false 911 call. That's the wild card. I've got a copy of the fire department and police reports. They both clearly state it was a false alarm and that my fire pit was fully compliant. If I can tie that into the pattern of harassment, it strengthens everything. Marcus leaned back in his chair. You know she's probably going to escalate before this is over. I'm counting on it. People like Patricia can't help themselves. The more she feels like she's losing control, the more aggressive she'll get and the more mistakes she'll make. I was right. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. Patricia started driving past my house multiple times a day. She'd slow down, sometimes stop and take photos or videos. I documented every instance. She sent 3 more letters, each one more threatening than the last. The daily fines continued to accrue. According to their accounting, I now owed $2,800 in fines. She also started showing up at random times. Once at 6 in the morning while I was getting my newspaper. Once at 10 at night when I was coming home from having dinner with friends. Once on a Saturday afternoon when I was mowing my lawn. Each time, she'd make comments about the fire pit, about my disrespect for the community, about how I was bringing down property values. I recorded everything, every interaction, every drive-by, every letter. I kept a detailed log with dates, times, and descriptions. I also started talking to my neighbors. What I learned was disturbing but not surprising. The neighbor to my right, a quiet guy named Tom who worked from home, told me that Patricia had fined him repeatedly for having a small vegetable garden in his backyard. The CCR said nothing about gardens, but she'd claimed it was unsightly and violated community standards. He'd eventually covered it with a privacy screen just to get her to stop harassing him. The neighbor behind me, a retired teacher named Grace, said Patricia had tried to fine her for painting her front door blue instead of the approved colors. Grace had fought back, showing that blue was actually on the approved color list that had been provided when she bought the house. Patricia had backed down but had made Grace's life miserable with petty complaints for months afterward. A couple 2 streets over told me they'd been fined for parking their own car in their own driveway overnight because it was a pickup truck, and Patricia claimed commercial vehicles weren't allowed. The CCRs actually said commercial vehicles weren't allowed to be parked on the street, but Patricia had interpreted it to include any truck anywhere. They'd paid the fine just to avoid the hassle. I was documenting all of this. With my neighbor's permission, I was gathering statements, copies of their correspondence with the HOA, records of fines paid. A pattern was emerging, and it was exactly what I needed. On November 1st, I used my fire pit again. It was a cool evening, perfect for sitting outside with a fire. I'd invited Tom and Grace over, and we were sitting around the fire pit, talking and enjoying the evening when Patricia appeared. This time, she didn't stop at the fence. She opened my back gate and walked right into my yard. "That's trespassing," I said immediately, standing up. "I need you to leave my property. I have the authority as HOA president to inspect properties for violations," she said, her phone out and recording. "No, you don't. Not without notice and permission. The CCRs are clear about that. You need to leave now. I'm documenting this violation. You're not only using the illegal fire pit, but you're hosting a gathering which requires HOA approval for any event with more than 10 people." Grace laughed. "There are 3 of us. That's not an event." Patricia swung her phone toward Grace. "You're defending this violation of community standards. I'm sitting with my neighbor in his backyard. If that's a violation, then this HOA has completely lost its mind. I can fine you for harassment of a board member," Patricia snapped. Tom stood up. "Okay, this has gone far enough. Patricia, you need to leave. You're the one harassing people." Patricia's face was bright red now. Fine, I'll leave. But this is all being documented. You're all in violation, and you're all going to face consequences." She stormed out, leaving my gate open. I closed it and then sat back down, making sure I'd gotten the entire interaction on video. "That woman is insane," Tom said. "Someone needs to stop her." "I'm working on it," I said, "but I need to do it the right way." The next day, I received a notice that the HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines totaling $3,200. They'd also added a $500 administrative fee for the cost of filing the lien. The notice stated that if the fines weren't paid within 30 days, They would begin foreclosure proceedings. This was it. This was the mistake I'd been waiting for. In Texas, HOAs can place liens for unpaid assessments, but not for fines related to disputed violations. They jumped the gun, and badly. I immediately filed a lawsuit in Travis County District Court. I sued the HOA and Patricia Kensington individually for declaratory judgment that the fines were invalid, removal of the illegal lien, harassment, and abuse of process. I also filed for a temporary restraining order to prevent any foreclosure proceedings. In my filing, I included every piece of documentation I'd gathered. Photos, videos, letters, witness statements from neighbors, copies of the HOA's own governing documents, my permits and inspections, the police and fire reports. The filing was 147 pages long. It was thorough, detailed, and damning. The temporary restraining order was granted within 48 hours. The judge's order specifically noted that the lien appeared to be improper and potentially malicious based on the preliminary evidence. It prohibited the HOA from taking any action related to the lien or assessing any additional fines pending a full hearing. Patricia showed up at my house that evening, waving a copy of the lawsuit. "You're suing me personally? How dare you?" I stood in my doorway, phone recording. "You acted beyond your authority as HOA president. You harassed me repeatedly. You filed a false police report. You placed an illegal lien on my property. Yes, I'm suing you personally because you're personally liable for those actions. The HOA's insurance will cover this. Maybe, but only if you were acting within the scope of your authority, and based on what I've documented, you weren't. Your insurance carrier is going to look at this case and see an HOA president who went rogue and violated state law repeatedly. They might decline coverage, which means you'll be personally on the hook for damages and my attorney's fees." Her face went from red to pale. "You're trying to ruin me." "I'm trying to stop you from ruining other people. There's a difference." She stood there for a long moment, and I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. Then she turned and left without another word. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for November 15th. Under Texas law, homeowners have the right to attend board meetings and speak during designated comment periods. I planned to be there. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. When I arrived, there were about 20 other homeowners there, which was apparently a much larger turnout than usual. Word had gotten around about the lawsuit. Patricia called the meeting to order, and she looked nervous. The other 4 board members looked uncomfortable. I recognized 2 of them as people who lived on my street. During the homeowner comment period, I stood up. "My name is Quentin Palmer, and I live at 1247 Oakmont Drive. I'm here to address the ongoing situation regarding my fire pit." Patricia interrupted immediately. "This matter is in litigation. We can't discuss it." "Actually, you can. There's no court order prohibiting discussion, and the other homeowners here deserve to know what's been happening." I proceeded to lay out the entire timeline, the legal installation of my fire pit, the false 911 call, the violations notices despite no actual violation of any written rule, the escalating fines, the illegal lien, the repeated harassment. I spoke for about 10 minutes, calmly and factually. When I finished, several other homeowners started speaking up. Tom talked about his garden. Grace talked about her door color. The couple with the pickup truck talked about that situation. Others shared their own stories of what they felt was overreach by the HOA board, particularly by Patricia. One of the other board members, a man named Robert who I'd learned was a retired accountant, cleared his throat. "I think we need to discuss some of these concerns. Patricia, Several of the actions described tonight were taken without full board approval. Patricia's eyes flashed. I have the authority as president to handle violations. You have the authority to enforce violations of actual rules, Robert said. But from what I'm hearing, and from what I've been reviewing in the HOA records, there have been multiple instances of enforcement actions taken for things that aren't actually in our governing documents. Another board member, a woman named Susan, nodded. I've been concerned about this too. We've been getting a lot of complaints, and our legal fees have skyrocketed. Robert and I have been reviewing the financials, and we've spent over $40,000 on legal fees in the past 18 months. The room erupted. Homeowners started asking questions, demanding answers. How much were the dues and where was the money going? Why were legal fees so high? What cases were being litigated? The meeting devolved into chaos and Patricia finally adjourned it early, but the damage was done. The board was fracturing, and the homeowners were waking up to what had been happening. Over the next 2 weeks, I received phone calls and visits from 3 of the 4 other board members. They all expressed similar sentiments. They hadn't been fully aware of everything Patricia had been doing. She'd been making a lot of decisions unilaterally, and they wanted to find a way to resolve things. I told them all the same thing. Remove the lien. Acknowledge in writing that my fire pit is not a violation. Rescind all fines, and agree to reforms in how the HOA operates. I also suggested that Patricia needed to step down as president. Meanwhile, my lawsuit was moving forward. We had a hearing scheduled for early December on the motion for summary judgment. I was confident. The evidence was overwhelming, but then something happened that I hadn't anticipated. The Travis County District Attorney's Office contacted me. They'd received the police report about the false 911 call, and in light of the pattern of behavior documented in my lawsuit, they were considering filing charges. Making a false report to emergency services is a serious matter. The assistant DA told me in his office. Your lawsuit has brought to light what appears to be a deliberate attempt to misuse emergency services to harass you. I appreciate you taking this seriously, I said, but what exactly are you thinking of charging her with? Filing a false report is a Class B misdemeanor, but given the circumstances, we're also looking at abuse of process and potentially filing a false emergency report, which can be enhanced if it diverted emergency resources from legitimate emergencies. Were there any actual emergencies that were delayed because of this? We're looking into that. There was a kitchen fire about 3 miles away that was reported about 10 minutes after the fire truck left your house. Response time was slightly delayed because the truck had to return to station first before being dispatched to the real fire. That changed things. If someone had been hurt or property damage had been worse because emergency resources were tied up at my house dealing with a fake emergency, Patricia could be facing more serious charges. What do you need from me? I asked. Just your cooperation. We'll need your documentation, your testimony, and access to any other evidence you've gathered. We'll handle the investigation from here. I provided everything they asked for. Copies of all my documentation, the videos, the timeline I'd created. I walked them through everything that had happened. 2 weeks later, on December 3rd, Patricia Kensington was arrested and charged with filing a false emergency report, a misdemeanor given the enhanced circumstances, and abuse of the 911 system. The story made the local news. HOA president arrested for false fire report was the headline on the Austin American-Statesman website. The HOA board held an emergency meeting the next day and voted to accept Patricia's resignation, which she'd submitted through her attorney. They also voted to remove the lien on my property, rescind all fines, and issue a written acknowledgement that my fire pit was not a violation of any HOA rules. Robert was elected as the new president. My lawsuit was still pending, though. While the HOA had taken some corrective action, I was still seeking damages for the harassment, the cost of having to defend myself, and attorney's fees. We proceeded with the summary judgment hearing on December 10th. The courtroom was smaller than you'd see on TV. Judge Marilyn Foster presided. She was a no-nonsense judge in her early 60s who I'd appeared before a few times in other real estate cases. She had a reputation for being fair but strict. The HOA's attorney, a tired-looking man named David Garrison, tried to argue that the HOA had already taken corrective action and that the matter should be dismissed as moot. I argued, representing myself with Marcus as backup counsel, that the actions taken didn't undo the damage or compensate me for the harassment and costs I'd incurred. I also argued that without a judgment establishing the wrongfulness of the HOA's actions, there was nothing preventing future boards from attempting similar overreach. Judge Foster reviewed the evidence, which took about 30 minutes of silence while she flipped through the binders I'd prepared. Finally, she looked up. "This is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of HOA overreach I've seen in 20 years on the bench," she said. "Mr. Palmer, your documentation is exceptional. It's clear that you were subjected to repeated harassment, that fines were improperly levied, and that a lien was improperly placed on your property." She turned to the HOA's attorney. "Mr. Garrison, does your client contest any of the facts as presented?" "Your Honor, while we acknowledge that mistakes were made, we believe the corrective actions taken demonstrate good faith and should mitigate any damages." "Mistakes?" Judge Foster raised an eyebrow. "These weren't mistakes. This was a systematic campaign of harassment by an HOA president who abused her authority. The fact that she's now facing criminal charges underscores the severity of this conduct." She ruled from the bench, granting my motion for summary judgment. She awarded me $25,000 in damages for harassment and emotional distress, attorney's fees of $18,000, and costs. She also issued a declaratory judgment that my fire pit was lawful and that the HOA was prohibited from taking any action against it. Furthermore, she ordered the HOA to implement a series of reforms, including mandatory training for board members on Texas property law, a new procedure requiring full board votes before any fines could be levied, and a requirement that homeowners be given clear notice and opportunity to respond before any enforcement action was taken. "This case should serve as a reminder," Judge Foster said, looking directly at the HOA's attorney, "that HOAs in Texas operate under the law, not above it. Board members who abuse their authority will be held accountable, both civilly and, as we've seen here, criminally." The HOA's attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The 3 board members who'd shown up for the hearing looked relieved that it was over. Outside the courtroom, Robert approached me. "I want to apologize on behalf of the board. Most of us had no idea how bad things had gotten with Patricia." "I appreciate that, Robert, but ignorance isn't really an excuse. You all had a duty to oversee what was happening." "You're right. We're going to do better. I've already started implementing some of the reforms Judge Foster ordered. We're also reviewing every fine levied in the past 2 years to see if there are other situations where people were treated unfairly." "That's good to hear. This neighborhood has potential to be a great place to live. It just needs leadership that respects homeowners' rights." "Agreed. And listen, I know this has been a nightmare for you, but thank you. If you hadn't fought back, Patricia would still be terrorizing people. Patricia's criminal case proceeded through the system. In February, she pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of filing a false report. She was sentenced to 6 months of probation, 80 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution to the city for the emergency response costs. She also had to write a letter of apology to me, which was perfunctory and clearly written by her attorney, but I didn't care. The point had been made. The civil judgment I'd won against the HOA was paid in full by early March. The check came with a new letter from Robert, informing all homeowners about the reforms being implemented and inviting everyone to the next board meeting to discuss how to rebuild trust in the community. I started attending the board meetings regularly, not to cause trouble, but to make sure things stayed on track. Other homeowners started attending too. Participation increased dramatically. People felt like they could speak up without fear of retaliation. In April, the HOA held a vote to amend the CCRs, clarifying various rules that had been ambiguous and removing outdated provisions. The amendments were designed to balance community standards with homeowners' rights. They passed with overwhelming support. Tom expanded his vegetable garden. Grace repainted her door a brighter shade of blue. The couple with the pickup truck parked it in their driveway every night without fear. And I used my fire pit regularly, often inviting neighbors over. The neighborhood started to feel like an actual community instead of a dictatorship. People talked to each other more, helped each other out, attended community events. Property values actually increased, contrary to Patricia's dire predictions. One evening in May, I was sitting by my fire pit when Grace came over with a bottle of wine. Tom showed up a few minutes later with some vegetables from his garden. We sat around the fire talking and laughing. "You know," Grace said, "I almost moved because of Patricia. I was so tired of the constant harassment, but now I'm glad I stayed." "Same here," Tom said. "This feels like what a neighborhood should be." "It does," I agreed, "and hopefully it stays this way." "Do you think you'll run for the board?" Grace asked. "A lot of people think you should." I considered it. "Maybe, not right now, though. Robert's doing a good job, and I think the board needs time to stabilize. But maybe down the line." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance. I thought about everything that had happened over the past 7 months. The harassment, the stress, the lawsuit, the criminal case. It had been exhausting, but it had been worth it. As a lawyer who'd spent years dealing with HOA disputes, I'd seen firsthand how much damage a power-hungry board member could do. I'd seen good people lose their homes, their savings, their peace of mind because they didn't know how to fight back or couldn't afford to. This case had given me something I rarely got in my profession: a clear victory. Not just for myself, but for all the other homeowners Patricia had targeted over the years, and for the ones who would have been targeted in the future if she'd continued unchecked. The fire pit crackled, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. My backyard was peaceful, exactly as it should be. This was my home, my property, my space, and I'd fought to protect my right to enjoy it. Later that week, I got an email from David Garrison, the HOA's attorney. He wanted to refer a potential client to me, someone in another neighborhood dealing with similar HOA overreach. I took the case. Then another, and another. Word spread in the Austin real estate legal community that I'd taken on an HOA and won decisively. Homeowners started seeking me out specifically for HOA disputes. I found myself building a practice area I hadn't really focused on before, and I loved it. Each case was different, but they all had common threads: HOAs overstepping their authority, board members drunk on power, homeowners who felt helpless against the bureaucracy. And in each case, I used the same approach that had worked with Patricia: meticulous documentation, thorough knowledge of the law, and the patience to let the opposition make mistakes. I won most of the cases, either in court or through settlements. A few required going all the way to trial, but the vast majority of HOAs backed down once they realized they were dealing with someone who knew the law and wasn't intimidated. By summer, I'd handled 15 HOA cases. I'd gotten illegal liens removed, improper fines rescinded, and abusive board members removed from power. I'd helped homeowners install solar panels despite HOA resistance, helped others keep their emotional support animals despite pet restrictions, and helped several fight discriminatory enforcement. The work was satisfying in a way that my regular real estate practice wasn't. I was helping people protect their homes and their rights. I was standing up to bullies. I was making a real difference in people's lives. And every time I won a case, I thought about that October evening when Patricia called 911 on my fire pit, never imagining that her harassment campaign would backfire so spectacularly. She'd picked on the wrong person, and in doing so, she'd inadvertently launched my career in a new direction and helped countless other homeowners in the process. The fire pit still sits in my backyard, properly permitted and completely legal. I use it regularly, usually with friends or neighbors. Sometimes I sit out there alone, enjoying the peace and quiet. And every time I light it, I'm reminded that knowing your rights and standing up for them matters. Patricia moved out of the neighborhood in June, selling her house and relocating somewhere in Dallas. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was selling because she couldn't stand the embarrassment of what had happened. I didn't feel bad for her. She'd brought it on herself through her own actions. The new owners of her house were a young couple with a baby. They were friendly, considerate neighbors. At the neighborhood 4th of July party, which was held in my backyard around my fire pit, they told me they'd specifically chosen Meadowbrook Heights because they'd heard it had reformed its HOA and was now a great place to live. "We looked at a lot of neighborhoods," the husband said, "but so many of them have HOA horror stories. When we researched this one and saw what had happened with you standing up to the old president, we knew this was a community that wouldn't tolerate that kind of abuse." It was gratifying to hear. The fight had been worth it, not just for me, but for everyone who'd live in this neighborhood in the future. As the summer evening cooled and the fire burned low, I looked around at my neighbors, my friends, gathered in my backyard. Tom was grilling vegetables from his garden. Grace was telling a funny story about her grandkids. Robert was discussing plans for a neighborhood beautification project that would actually be voted on by the homeowners instead of dictated by the board. Kids were running around playing tag. Someone had brought a guitar and was playing softly. This was what community was supposed to look like. Not a dictatorship run by someone on a power trip, but a group of people choosing to live together in a way that respected everyone's rights and dignity. My phone buzzed with an email from a new potential client in a neighborhood up in Round Rock. Another HOA dispute, another homeowner being bullied. I'd respond tomorrow. Tonight was for enjoying the life I'd fought to protect. The fire pit crackled one last time as the flames died down to glowing embers. I added another log, not ready for the evening to end. The fire came back to life, warm and bright, exactly as it should be. Exactly as I'd known it would be that night back in October when I'd carefully read every regulation, gotten every permit, done everything by the book. Patricia had called the police on my fire pit, not knowing I was a lawyer, not knowing I'd documented everything perfectly, not knowing that she was handing me all the evidence I'd need to not only defend myself, but to expose her entire pattern of abuse. She'd thought she was enforcing the rules, but she was actually breaking them. She'd thought she was protecting the neighborhood, but she was actually terrorizing it. She'd thought she had all the power, but she'd forgotten the most important rule of all. In America, the law matters more than someone's opinion of what the law should be. And that fire pit, the source of all the conflict, had become a symbol of something bigger. It represented the right of homeowners to enjoy their property without arbitrary interference. It represented the importance of standing up to bullies, even when they have official titles and organizational backing. It represented the fact that documentation, knowledge, and persistence could overcome even the most aggressive opposition. I raised my beer in a silent toast to that fire pit, to the fight it had sparked, and to the community that had emerged stronger because of it. The flames danced in response, as if they understood. Life in Meadowbrook Heights was good, finally. The HOA had learned its lesson. The homeowners had found their voice, and I had found a new purpose in my legal practice. All because Patricia Kensington had made the mistake of calling the police on a completely legal fire pit, never imagining that the homeowner she was harassing would turn out to be someone who knew exactly how to fight back and win. The evening stretched on, warm and peaceful, filled with laughter and friendship. This was home. This was community. This was worth fighting for, and fight for it I had, armed with nothing but the law, good documentation, and the determination to stand up for what was right. As the last guests left and I doused the fire for the night, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. A bully had been stopped. A community had been saved. And it had all started with one person refusing to be intimidated, knowing his rights and being willing to defend them. The empty backyard was quiet now, the fire pit cooling in the night air. Tomorrow I'd clean it out and get it ready for the next gathering. Because there would be many more gatherings, many more evenings around this fire, many more moments of community and connection. Patricia had tried to take that away, and she'd failed. The fire pit remained, legal and legitimate, a testament to the power of standing up for your rights and refusing to back down in the face of injustice.